Hello, so here we have SyrianGirl, also known as Maram Susli, and we had an interview a little bit more than 6 months ago, and it's been happening a lot in both Syria and the neighboring countries. And what's on your mind? What's important happening the last few weeks?
Well, the most important thing that happened the last few weeks is the Iran attack on the US base in Iraq. So basically, and the assassination of Soleimani. So basically, what you guys need to know is that the United States and Iran have been trying to push each other out of the Near East, which is, Syria and Iraq. So, and Lebanon. They're trying to out-influence each other, and Iran is winning at the moment. But previously, what's happened was the US has been backing protests against the Iranian embassy in Iraq, and after that, they bombed a paramilitary force called the PMU, which fought ISIS. And as a result, the people who were part of this Iraqi PMU force protested against the US embassy. And after that, long story short, the US assassinated Iran's second highest ranking, or number one highest ranking general, and perhaps the second highest ranking leader in Iran, killed him in Iraq right after he landed in Iraqi airport. So as a result of that, Iran had to retaliate, and they launched ballistic missiles at a US base in Iraq and basically demolished the base. Most of the people survived because they used bunkers that were built by Saddam, interestingly. But the interesting thing is the US didn't respond. They couldn't retaliate against Iran. And now, since that time, Iraqi parliament has called for the end of the US occupation in Iraq, and the US has refused to comply. And today were some of the biggest protests that Iraq has ever seen in the last 2 decades, which are protests against the US presence in Iraq. Millions of people marching in Baghdad to end the US occupation. And again, the US and the US media is just ignoring them, trying to pretend that it never happened.
So yeah, what we've been reading about here in the Western media, it's the protest in Iraq against the government, I guess. That was like before the assassination of Soleimani. And we've also been reading about protest in Iran against the government. I think that's the main topics, like if you're talking about different protests.
Yeah, so you're getting this because the US is backing the protests in Iran. The group that's funding them is called the MEK, which is basically used to be designated a terrorist organization by the United States. It's a hardcore communist group that is opposed to the current Iranian government. So, of course, the US is backing these people now. So that's why they're trying to destabilize things inside Iran. At the same time, the protests that you heard about in Iraq were the ones attacking the Iranian embassy. But now the much, much, much bigger protests against the US occupation is not even being heard of in the news, even though obviously there are massive, massive crowds opposed to the occupation, which began now 16, 17 years ago, and the war is still going. So obviously there's a lot of opposition to the US in Iraq.
So basically, it's a kind of regime change methods to using because they cannot use military force to try to create this protest, and the media only reports when it's gaining the US policy, basically.
Yes, so they'll only report on the protests if they're supportive of US policy, and they can't use military force against Iran. They had a perfect opportunity to do so after Iran launched ballistic missiles at a US base, but they obviously think that the damage that they would sustain is one that they're not prepared to. They'd win at the end, but they would get a lot of damage. So, and usually the US only likes to attack weak countries. So that's why they're trying to do, the usual color revolution, regime change, because they can't oppose them directly, as you said. But it's not working. That's their frustration. It's simply not working. And as a matter of fact, the protests in opposition to the US are much bigger. And this has put the US in a very, very weak position in the Middle East.
And like, why does the who in the US wants to keep this war running? Because it's not like they're gaining a lot of money and they have to sacrifice like soldiers and it must take a lot of time and like effort to keep, because the conflict in Syria started 2011, many years ago, and they've been involved in Iran and Iraq for decades already. And it's if you just people don't know the geography, like you have Syria close to the Mediterranean Sea, then you have bordering Iraq, and then you have Iraq bordering Iran, like to the east. And then you have Afghanistan even further east. But they've been involved in all these blocks of countries for decades in different ways. What's their end goal? Why can't they just let the people there decide themselves how they want to run their countries?
That's the real irony, because they claimed that they were bringing democracy to Iraq in 2003, and they set them up, and they had elections, and the US, said, look at the democracy that we created. And then when the prime minister of Iraq and Iraq's parliament say they want the US to leave now, they said, oh no, we don't agree. You're not legitimate.
So it's
Suddenly,
like
they don't even respect.
yeah, so they take out Saddam Hussein, they say he's a dictator, and they put in a parliament, but they don't listen to what the parliament want to say. So it's
Yes, so they're the dictators now.
yeah,
The whole
yeah.
the democracy thing was such a sham in the first place. Um, so yes, the important thing to remember is they're not actually making any money. Trump might talk about stealing Iraq's oil, stealing Syria's oil, but they're actually not making money off Iraq or Syria's oil. They're not actually stealing it. The only thing they're doing is they're preventing Syria and Iraq from benefiting from that oil. So they're preventing Syria specifically from getting to its own oil and using it to fuel its own citizens, the cars of its own citizens. I mean, Syria has oil, enough for Syria, but because the US is occupying it, it doesn't have enough oil even for its own people anymore.
Yeah, you never
So
read like as a Syria as an oil exporter. Like it doesn't really affect the oil price if Syria has a conflict because
yeah,
it's never been exported. So
it's not an exporter. Like we have one out of, like, Saudi Arabia has 100 more times more barrels than Syria does. The US is an oil giant as well. So Syria doesn't even have that much oil, but the oil that we do have, we need for our own cars. Like, Syrian cars are currently like under gridlock because they don't. Taxi cabs are standing in line in front of petrol stations because Syria doesn't have enough fuel anymore, and Trump is claiming that the US is profiting from it. But no, it's not. This is not about profit. The only way you can understand the US's actions in the Middle East is if you stop thinking about it in terms of money and in terms of like benefit to the United States. If you start to think about it in terms of the benefit it has for Israel, then it starts to make sense. If you start to think about it in terms of power, then it starts to make sense. So
yeah,
if you think,
I was thinking.
sorry,
Sorry to interrupt. No, I was
sure.
thinking like because now it seems it left like before it was these rebel groups like IS and all the terrorists like fighting, but now it's more like they're using like this assassination of Soleimani and they're trying to do some color revolutions, but it's still these rebels that have been since 2011. What are different sides? To me, you have a side of Saudi Arabia sponsoring terror groups and Turkey has their own terror groups, and maybe some other Gulf states, and Israel is also sponsoring some groups and giving them health care, and USA had their groups. So it's like when you have these wars in the Middle East, the last 10 years, instead of using the main military, they're using lots of terror groups with thousands of members and very high-tech equipment. And Soleimani he was sponsoring rebels in different countries, right, to fight some of these terrorists. I assume like he was
Yes.
fighting IS and had his like a counter militia group to
Yeah.
so
Exactly. So, as I
yeah.
told you at the beginning, this militia is called the PMU, which is the People's Mobilization Forces. Because nowadays, when you hear like Iranian militias, is what you hear thrown out there into the media as if it's or automatically a negative thing. But the reality is that these the PMU were a group of militias that were paramilitary forces that worked alongside the Iraqi army to fight ISIS. And they didn't just have Shiites in them, they had Yazidis in them and other things as well, Assyrian Christians. So these are the people that were on the front lines fighting ISIS. And now that ISIS is no longer an excuse for the US to stay, they have to create a new enemy. And so they're killing the people that fought ISIS. This is just an excuse to remain in the Middle East.
Yeah, so you always have to find new enemies because ISIS is there's only a few terror cells and a few prisoners that left, you know. It's like not relevant, so you have to find something to replace them.
Yes, and
So now
Iran and the people,
is the Iranian militias now that's the enemy, I guess.
yes,
In
or they're not
Syria,
even Iranian, they're Iraqi. That's the
but they
crazy
train
thing.
they might get some weapons or training from Iran at some point.
Yeah, and
And they're and
but
then
they're yes.
yeah, yeah, okay. So I was thinking, we talked last interview, maybe we talked a lot about Syria, and a lot of the things you said came true in different ways. For example, in the west part of Syria, you have is a region called Idlib, right? That have rebels groups mostly or terrorist group mostly sponsored by Turkey.
Yes,
And
and
this,
they're the leaders, the people who control Idlib is Al Qaeda.
yeah,
So the head of Al Qaeda, Al Jolani, and if you recall, the head of ISIS, Al Baghdadi, was also hiding in Idlib.
yeah. So they have like they're protected by Turkish military, and the Turkish have the so-called observation points with a lot of tanks and equipment, and
Sure.
but the Russians and Syria have been taking back quite much of that land now, and they're having like fights almost every day to take back more land.
Yes, I think I told you that would happen last time, didn't I?
Yeah. So and now
Yeah.
actually Turkey has been moving some rebels to Libya instead.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that these people are, if they don't put them somewhere, they're gonna start causing trouble inside Turkey probably because all they know is how to be a mercenary at the moment. It's all about money now.
I'm not sure who it was, but I think it was someone who was based in Turkey. I'm not sure if it was the Turkish leader, but he said like we go wherever it's jihad, you know. So like they didn't care if they fight in Syria or if they're sent to Libya. They just wanna, it's these people who wanna fight for some very vague cause, you know.
Isn't it interesting that the jihad is always against other Muslims?
Mm. So because in 2011, like a lot of these rebels came from Libya, and now they're sending other rebels back. Maybe not the same people, but it goes in, like in a circle.
Isn't it interesting? Yes, a lot of Libyans came to Syria on aid ships, if you would believe. So, yes, they would pretend to be aid workers, and they were actually the Libyan Liberation Army or whatever it was called, which were basically terrorists. And now it's going back the other way. I feel sorry for Libya.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
because they had like two different factions, and the one that was losing, Turkey is supporting them now to try and they want some oil or gas fields in the Mediterranean Sea they want to control. So
Well, they basically don't want Libya to be united with one faction ruling. because then Libya would become independent
Yeah.
and the war would end. And God forbid a war should end.
Yeah, it's like in Libya, it's going even longer than Syria. I think it started 2009 or something. It was even longer
Yeah,
ago.
2010. Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, 2010. Okay, so could you give us some more details on the different groups? Why is Saudi Arabia allied with USA and Israel, and why are they having this terrorist group over like in Yemen and in Syria and all over the region? Why can't use diplomacy or use the military? Why is it this proxy groups is used? It seems the method they want to use, or this kind of color revolution. So why is it so important to change the governments all the time there?
Sure.
What do they really want to do?
Well, if you look at the way that China goes about its interactions with other countries, they usually open up other countries economically um, by building railways, etc. So the question becomes, why does the US feel it necessary to have a perpetual war and instability in that particular region when it could just as equally, for example, like it's currently allied to Saudi Arabia. So obviously Islam is not a something that would prevent them from becoming allies with the country. It could equally be allied to Iran, or it could be allied to Syria, which is a secular country. I mean, what is to prevent the US from uh, dealing with these countries in a diplomatic and economic way that would benefit both countries? And again, as I said, the only way that its actions can make sense is if you understand it in terms of what of Israel. Because even Trump said himself, like the reason why we're there is for oil and to protect Israel. So when Israel was created by the British, it was meant to be. It was in a way part of the idea that the British and the French had to break up the Middle East into little factions where there's Christians here in Lebanon, there's Sunnis over here, there's Shiites over there, there's Kurds over here, and there's Jews over here. So it's like a factionalization. And to make these small factions makes them easier to control, kind of like the way that Yugoslavia was balkanized as well. And when it comes to Israel, Israel has its own idea, and that is a biblical desire to control regions of Syria as well as the rest of what is left over Palestine and regions of Lebanon as well. And Syria, of course, sees Zionism for that reason as an existential threat because they want to take over Syrian territory. There's no way that Syria can ally with a country that's continuously expanding its borders, because Israel has never actually declared its borders, because its borders are something that's always growing. It's basically like ISIS. ISIS's borders were always growing. It had this religious idea that God granted them that territory. And it just happens to be Syrian territory all the time. So that's how Syria sees Israel. It sees it as the Jewish ISIS. And so Syria can never be allied to Israel. And for that reason, Syria will always be the enemy of the United States. And the only reason that the United States doesn't like Iran is because Iran is helping Syria. I mean, if Iran wasn't helping Syria, then Iran wouldn't be a problem. Iran would be like another Saudi Arabia.
So it's all connecting because Syria is bordering Iraq and Iraq is bordering Iran, and you have to be able to, they're fighting on influence in all those countries because they're interrelated.
Yes, because they want to break up a connection between Iran and Syria, because then Syria is getting support from Iran through Iraq, and as a result of that, their objectives to destroy Syria and do regime change is now like reaching its last breath, and that is a source of frustration for them, because again, like Iran, Iraq, and Syria and Lebanon, when as they call it, the resistance axis, this is going to be a direct threat to Israel. And as we know, the Zionist lobby is undoubtedly very, very strong in the United States.
Yeah, it's hard to understand because the situation seems dangerous because Russia is also involved in supporting one faction in Libya and one faction in Syria, and Russia is also, you could say, they're allied with Iran because they help them with the air defense system and so on, and you have USA also mixed in together, and you even have NATO shooting down some Russian plane a few years ago. I think Turkey did it, and it's like you have so
That's
many
right.
even big countries fighting in that area. It's like a mini world war. It's so many countries involved in that. And
Other than the Israel aspect of it, of course, the other aspect is the rivalry of the US and Russia in the European region. And Russia has been, since the fall of the Soviet Union, failing in that to maintain its sphere of influence. And the fact that it lost Ukraine, even though it maintained Crimea, the fact that it even was able to lose Ukraine to the Western sphere is a sign of how much like receding influence it had. When NATO was created, it was created in order to contain the USSR. Warsaw has been disbanded and yet NATO still exists. And if you see the amount of American bases surrounding Russia or NATO bases surrounding Russia, you will see that it's actually Russia that's being surrounded. The last vestige of influence that Russia has in the Middle East, its last stronghold, is Syria. Its last position on the Mediterranean Sea is that base that in Syria, in Tartus. Otherwise, it will, not have much movement inside the Mediterranean Sea. So for Russia, Syria is like a red line, and it had to do something about it. And NATO is still trying to isolate Russia for those reasons.
how do you think Israel is able to gain so much influence? But there must be some kind of deep state inside of Israel who have their policy. I mean, because I guess some people in Israel might be very like supporting of their governments, but I don't think like everyone is that. So there must be like a hardcore like deep state complex in Israel also, because they never change their policy. It doesn't matter who's elected. It's always the same.
I think from that you have to go back to who created Israel in the first place. And if you know about the Balfour Declaration, it was actually a letter written in like before even World War One. I think it was 1914, where Lord Balfour declared that Israel would be, Palestine would become a home for the Jewish people. There was no such thing as Israel at that time. It was just Palestine. And it was after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, it became under the control of the British. So, but who did Lord Balfour address that letter? I mean, it's a letter. He wrote it to someone. He actually addressed it to Lord Rothschild, which is obviously one of the most powerful banking families that also happened to be Jewish. And before Israel even existed, the Rothschilds were the biggest advocates of Zionism and convinced the British monarchy and the government to sign up to the creation of Israel. And that family and its influence over the banking system it still exists today, and it's still important in terms of foreign policies of the US. I think that there's a monetary aspect to the Zionist lobby, as well as blackmail. I mean, if you look at Epstein, we now know that he was a Mossad agent. His partner in crime, Ghislaine Maxwell, is a Mossad agent. She has connections. This was even revealed now in the mainstream media. And her father was a Mossad agent. And Epstein was running a blackmail operation. He was being funded by the big group, I believe they're called, which Epstein, where did he get all his money? He was a billionaire financier, but his only client for his financial dealings was a man who ran the Victoria's Secret models, like the lingerie salesman. I forget his name. However, this man he knows the president of Israel, and he also is part of a group that funds Israeli leaderships inside the United States. So, it just goes to show you how deep this web goes. I mean, Epstein had blackmail information about royalty around the world, including Saudi Arabia and, the presidents of the United States, Bill Clinton, the Trump, Hollywood. He had the, blackmail information about members inside Hollywood. So obviously they used this sexual blackmail to get these politicians to do what they want, as well as, they have Trump's son-in-law, Kushner. He's friends with Netanyahu. So these connections are very, very, they've been working on them for decades. And now they're so entrenched that it just can't be separated.
I think another, I don't know if it's verified, but I read that Ghislaine Maxwell has a twin sister who works in some tech company. And her technology was supposedly used by some government agencies also. So
I mean, it's not a coincidence that the creator of Facebook, Zuckerberg, is a friend of Netanyahu. It's the tech companies in the Silicon Valley are very much in Israel's hands. I don't know about the twin though. I have to.
Yeah, I read about it that she has a twin that was running some tech companies, and I got like that specific software was used in some governments for like searching databases, but I haven't read so much about it. I read it earlier today, and now even now it doesn't matter. Now you cannot criticize Israel. I think in some states USA I read it's like they have laws that
it's become anti-Semitic.
If you say something wrong about Israel, it's anti-Semitic. Like, so it seems very. If you want to hide something, you can just involve Israel at some point, and then you can never talk about it. So it's like
you can say whatever you want about the United States. I mean, you can set the United States flag on fire, but you can't talk about Israel. Isn't that? Yeah. I mean, isn't that shows you how much influence there is in the country?
Yeah. I was thinking, I don't know, as we have a Swedish audience, and I know you commented on Greta Thunberg nowadays, because it seems like there's no real like anti-war movement with the young people. Like everyone is, or the biggest movement now is the climate protest. And I've also been writing about Australia, where you live, that it's because this climate change, you have all the fires. What do you think about this movement she's leading? Is it something that's positive, or what do you think about it?
I find it repulsive that more attention is given to a change in climate, which is arguably man-made, but potentially not, versus a problem that is 100% man-made, which is wars, which is killing far more people and has a potential to kill way more if it goes nuclear. And I think the hysteria about global warming is nothing compared to the hysteria that should be about World War III, that we narrowly escaped a couple of weeks ago, that was trending at least on Twitter. I mean, grassroots-wise, people understand that there's a threat here, but the media is telling them that the threat is climate change, and they should listen to the 16-year-old autistic girl whose parents are very rich. She knows Monaco royalty. She was on a boat that was owned by the royals. I mean, if she was a real when I was a 16-year-old girl, I would protest the Iraq War. I would protest, for Palestine. I would skip school and stand on the side of the road, but I didn't win a Nobel Prize. And this is because I didn't have a machine behind me that
That
would
machine
promote
you're talking about, to me, it's not like it's a color revolution. It's not like taking down a country, but you have so many foundations, and it's
the
like
Bill Gates Foundation.
it's billions of dollars who's founding these movements who like might, if you don't know about the topic or you don't know the science, it might seem good at the surface, but then you look at who's going to benefit from the carbon taxes, and that
Yes.
then and that people don't cannot afford to drive cars or to fly airplanes, and it's like making people like basically like peasants again, that they have the masters like going in
While they
jets all
fly
over the
in
world,
their
and
private jets.
yeah, and in Sweden, people like it's a long country, and people who live far away from the city, they don't even afford to buy gasoline, and they cannot buy like a Tesla for like $100,000. I mean,
Yeah.
so it's like
Or
a dilemma.
and
What's it?
Greta's complaining about her first class train ticket.
Yeah, okay, but I want to have your take on that because I noticed you been talking about it.
It annoys me to no end that they can mobilize that much. I guess I get, again, it's a very safe topic as well. Everybody can care about the environment, but if you start talking about wars, then people are become very easily confused about what is right and what is wrong. But it's very easy to just say, "Well, I care about the environment," with like blindly not realizing that a carbon tax. Okay, when they say net zero carbon, they don't mean that they're going to stop producing carbon. Net zero means carbon plus an offset of carbon equals zero. So they're still going to be putting carbon out into the atmosphere, but now we're going to be funding all of these extra companies that are supposed to offset the carbon. And so, we have the petrodollar, where we pay $1 for per certain amount of oil. And then now you have the carbon tax, which is like the petrodollar, but with an added cost with for these new startup companies that are going to be making all the money. And it's no coincidence that someone like Bill Gates is funding this, or Al Gore, or the British royal family are taking an interest. These people are there to make money, and they're going to make money off poor people. And now, Macron who is connected to the Rothschild Central Bank. He was a banker for the Rothschilds. He was trying to put a carbon tax on the French people to make them to squeeze them even harder, using the environment as a claim. I mean, do these people realize that they're basically spitting upon? It's like we call them champagne socialists. They talk about socialism and the environment with a champagne glass in their hand because they don't know how what they're saying, what they're doing, how it will affect actual working class people.
So, last time we made an interview, you said what you think was going to happen, like the coming year, and I think you were mostly correct on the main points. So the situation now in Syria, as I understand it, the Syrian army and Russia is start to take back the region in the west, Idlib, and Turkey is moving out some of their rebels to Libya. So it seems they're not putting all their resources on holding the region. So it's probably going to fall eventually. And then
Yes.
you have some areas in the north controlled by Turkey, and some areas are patrolled by the Russians and Syrian armies. So Syria got more land back since last time we talked.
Yes.
And then
Absolutely.
and then we have the USA who like gather a lot of troops around the Syrian oil fields.
That's right.
And then you have like some few terrorist cells around the country, like making some small attacks, but it doesn't seem really relevant. It's not like how it was a few years ago.
You're absolutely, you've described it perfectly.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how do you think this could develop? Because even if it's something changed, it seems kind of like some kind of a stalemate. Like no one really wants to leave totally. Like everyone wants to
Okay,
stay.
so as you said, as I said last time, Idlib, and as you just said, Idlib will be solved, as in the Syrian military will take back the entirety of Idlib. And Al Qaeda controls Idlib right now, so obviously they can't leave it like that. Russia will be involved. What will happen probably is we're going to see more of these civilian corridors opening up, which means civilians are going to be able to get out of Idlib. And when that happens, basically, the rebels will no longer have human shields to use and they will collapse very quickly. But Turkey will not have control over Idlib, but they will still have control over the northern border of Syria. Afrin was handed to Turkey by the Kurdish SDF militia, basically, because the Kurdish militia, the SDF, they refused the help of the Syrian military to go into the areas that they control, and they said that they will resist Turkey on their own, and then they ended up just collapsing within days to the Turkish military. And this has happened in Afrin, in across basically now the entire northern region of Turkey. And the question has been, how do we get the Turks out? That's very dangerous because they're basically Turkey will always be. This is something that the Syrian president said recently in an interview. Like Turkey will always be a reality for Syria because it will always be one of Syria's neighbors. So we have to find a way to live with Turkey. The same can't be said. He said that the same can't be said of Israel, but that's another story. So I think what's going to happen is that Turkey is going to use the territory that it's gained control over to get concessions in negotiations with the Syrian government and Russia. It's going to use that territory as a holding tool to get concessions in negotiations.
I don't know how accurate it is, but I understood that that Russia made some concessions in Libya because Russia is sponsoring one of the factions in Libya, and they've been having meetings in Moscow about the situation in Libya, and the Turkish agreed to pull back some of their sponsored terrorists from Idlib during the talks about Libya. So that might be a
That's a
factor.
very good observation. I wasn't aware of like that, but I do think that Russia and Turkey are slowly reaching some kind of understanding, and that I think is probably is going to have repercussions in Libya, but it's also going to have repercussions in Syria, and especially for the Kurdish groups. I think that it's going to prevent the balkanization of Syria as well, which was like Turkey was a good counter pivot for the US agenda in Syria and the creation of a Kurdistan. So I think that the influence that Turkey's gained influence in the negotiating sphere because of the controlled land, but I think the further in future is they're going to negotiate a Turkish pullout. Problem is that the Turkish pullout cannot happen before the US pulls out because the Turkish invasion of Syria is actually contained the US invasion in the region of the oil fields. But the interesting thing is, if the US is kicked out of Iraq, they have to get out of Syria. It's very, very, very difficult for them to stay because they're not going to get supplied from Turkey. So where are their supply lines going to come from? The Kurdish region of Iraq. But Turkey controls that border point. So they basically a pull out from, if they agree to pull out of Iraq, there's like a 90% chance they're going to pull out of Syria at the same time.
So the USA cannot trust Turkey for support for like a few more years. It's not
No,
certain. No.
no, because Turkey, because the agenda that the US has in Syria is to create a Kurdistan, and which would be a catastrophe for Turkey. So, you know, they can't be trusted to stay there. I mean, I guess they negotiated the idea that they stay in the oil fields, but then the Kurds, like, how long are they going to accept that status quo? How long is Syria going to accept that status quo without its oil? It's not a situation that can last. It's precarious. In any case, how are they going to be pushed out of Iraq is what's going to start evolving here. If they don't heed the request of Iraqi parliament to leave, if they don't pay attention to these protests, then we're going to see the same thing we saw in 2003, which is a resistance movement against the occupation. Only this time they won't just be facing the Sunnis, they'll be facing the Shiites as well. And they will be losing soldiers there. And I think they'll start to lose soldiers in Syria as well. Things are going to get more and more uncomfortable for the United States in Syria and Iraq in the coming months.
I don't know if you would call it diplomacy, but part of this whole conflict is sanctions and economic warfare. Like, because you have real sanctions, quite harsh, both against Syria and Iran, and even if you're a company in Europe or whatever part of the world, if you make business with Iran or in some cases Syria, like you're blocked from U.S. markets, like so they block you out.
100% with Syria as well. I mean, the sanctions affected Syria. It has affected Syria, but Syria practices the principle of self-sufficiency. So the fact that Syria has its own factories and its own manufacturing and it's kind of like its own biodome, it's protected it from those sanctions. So I don't think the sanctions are enough to force Syria to do anything.
Yeah, and now I accept the sanctions. Economically, I heard Trump and other politicians threatening they're going to ruin
Iraq.
Turkey. They're going to like deny access to the Federal Reserve banking system to making payments and selling oil or whatever, like to use for the
Yes.
to have the dollar accounts maybe. And
Yeah.
a few months ago he was threatening Turkey with the same.
How
And
nice they are to their friends, their allies.
yeah, so I don't know if you call it diplomacy, but it's more about because the US dollar is still the world currency and they control a lot of the banking system. And so if it
I mean,
doesn't,
with friends like this, who needs enemies?
yeah,
This is Turkey is supposed to be one of their oldest allies.
yeah, and they tried to overthrow Erdogan a few years ago with this.
Yes, they did. The CIA tried and failed
Yeah,
because of FaceTime. That was hilarious. Do you remember
I don't
he
remember.
was on the phone?
I read that a lot of like they used the cell phone system to send out warnings to the supporters that you have to get out in the street and resist, the coup and.
Yes, that's right. But Erdogan was interviewed on a mobile phone. That's what prevented him from being, because they were saying he left the country and all of this stuff. So yeah, the CIA tried to overthrow him, probably over the Kurdish thing. So Erdogan is now hardened more than ever because Turkey has a chance, like it always has the option open to switch to the Russian and Chinese sphere. And Russia would much rather have Turkey as an ally than to have it as a NATO enemy. And they would much prefer Turkey over the Kurds. So it's like a good trade for Russia. So why would the US throw away one of its strongest allies, one of the biggest armies in NATO, over this Kurdish agenda? The reason, again, is Israel. I mean, Israel has this plan to create a Kurdistan, to have them control everything after the Euphrates River, because of this thing they have, the Oded plan that they created in 1982, that is a means by which to weaken Syria and Iraq. That's why they want to do it. They want to weaken Syria, Iraq, and Iran, And that's what the US wanted to do, but it also destroys half of Turkey, and Turkey's not going to accept that no matter what, no matter what sanctions they put on it. It's not something Turkey's going to accept. And I think the US has realized that they've reached their limit, the limit of what they can do with Turkey, because Turkey has purchased air defenses from Russia. They have S-400s now, and no amount of threats from the United States were able to prevent that. So I think they've basically maxed out what they can achieve with sanctions, and even with Iraq, they can threaten Iraq with sanctions, but it's not like Iraq has that much autonomy. Let's
So
let's
basically, it's
realistically.
whoever neocons who's controlling U.S. foreign policy. I mean, they played most of the cards. Then there's not so much left to do.
There's not much left to do except to send soldiers back into Iraq and start 2003 all over again. So that's the question now. Are they gonna walk away from this pretending mission accomplished with their head held high, we defeated ISIS, or are we gonna go back to 2003?
Yeah. How do you think the general how is the population in Syria, Iraq, and Iran like? Because it's also real people here. You only talk about the politicians, and it's more like the people. You don't talk so much in the news about the people in the countries, except when it's a protest. Are the people there like supportive of the governments, and they want the foreign influence out?
Everybody wants the foreign influence out. Like everybody wants them out. The only people that are that want the United States to stay in Iraq and Syria are the Kurdish militias, not even the Kurdish people. Just the Kurdish militias that think that they can get personal gain by occupying Syria's oil fields and by occupying Iraq's oil fields and by controlling more and more land of Iraq that belongs to other minorities, like the Assyrian Christians and the Yazidis and Sunnis as well.
So if
So
the USA would make another deal with the Kurdish militias again, maybe that could make something happen.
the
But
thing is that they're incompetent. Um, so if you recall, they tried to do a referendum that like separates the Kurdish region from the rest of Iraq. And they wanted to include territory that wasn't even part of the um, Kurdish region that was drawn up in the constitution. They wanted to include territory that they took over during the battles with ISIS, where basically other minorities live which aren't even Kurdish. So basically all of Iraq is mixed. So, trying to draw borders of Kurds here and everyone else there, it doesn't really make sense in the first place. But they basically encroached on areas that are not majority Kurdish and wanted to claim them as part of the Kurdistan. But they broke they broke the constitution, so the Iraqi military went in, and the whole entire thing collapsed. So they're incompetent allies, and they're not going to get very far with them.
okay, thanks a lot for analysis. I was thought we could finish off by I guess there's probably a lot of people listening and feel they want to do something. What can the regular person do who has some knowledge about this? Does it help to talk about it on social media and to spread information, or does
I
anyone
think it does
listen? Or
because yes, because there's so much disinformation out there. I think especially for the Swedish public, they're fed a lot of disinformation, in particular by left-wing liberal Zionists and the left that promote the idea of a Kurdish state, especially. And I think I encourage Swedish people to question everything that they hear and to look up who are the Kurdish people, how did they get into Iraq, Syria, and Iran. And what I'm about to tell you, please look it up yourself. You'll understand that these are Iranian people. They speak Iranian, one of the Iranian languages, or multiple of them. So they're Iranic. They are a part of Iran which lived nomadic lives, and they moved into the West Asian countries, the Semitic-speaking countries, while they were herding their goats and sheep in the mountains. And the regions that they moved into, there was already people there, like Armenians in east of Turkey, Anatolians, Turks, Semitic-speaking Arabs, Iraqis, Syrians, and so to Assyrian Christians especially as well. So these people were nomadic until the end of World War One, and the reason that is important is that they never built a city or town, because the cities and towns were built by the people who have been there for tens of thousands of years. And so to decide suddenly that those territories belong to Kurds and Kurds alone, and not all the other minorities that live there, that's racism. That's the kind of thing that Israel was built on. So please question what you're being told by your media, because it'll have you supporting the bad guys and oppressing the good guys, and supporting wars and cutting up countries, thinking that you're doing a good cause. So educating people is very, very important, because once they get a little taste of the truth,
I'm not sure I understand.
Sorry, that's my watch. Once they get a little taste of the truth, I think it will expose all the lies, and they themselves will start to educate others.
One thing I forgot to talk about, just you could mention briefly, is I don't think people say it straight out, but sometimes it's portrayed in media that the government in Iran is very like extremist, like is lacking women rights and so on. But you had other types of government in Iran before that was more Western, and that didn't protect them from getting overthrown by USA. Do you have anything to say about that, like historically in Iran?
Sure. Iran at the moment is nothing compared to Saudi Arabia, because Iran's women can become pilots. They can fly planes in the Iranian, Saudi Arabian women until recently couldn't drive. Iranian women can become lawyers. They're in government. They're any job basically Iranian women can do. That's not the same for Saudi Arabian women. The oppression of women in Iran is centered around modesty, control over what they wear. And whilst I don't agree with that, it's nothing compared to what goes on in Saudi Arabia or Afghanistan, for example, which are allies of the United States. So obviously the United States doesn't care about that. And as a matter of fact, the United States overthrew the Shah of Iran in 1973. Now, I don't know the reasoning they had behind that, but I suspect they had a long-term plan to have a Shia-Sunni war, and maybe a Shiite-controlled Iran would have been beneficial towards that. In any case, anyone trying to use women's rights to convince you that there needs to be war and instability is someone who doesn't care about women, because women are going to be killed in those wars. So please do not buy it.
Yeah, it's very confusing, the propaganda, especially when Iran was more Western a long time ago, like before you have all the intervention.
Just remember that they tried to use women's rights to convince people to go to war with Syria, and they also did it in Libya. I mean, they accused Gaddafi of having rape rooms, and as we know now, the people that they put into power in Libya were Islamists, and Gaddafi was secular, and obviously the Syrian government is secular, and the people that they try to put in power in Syria were Islamists, and yet they still try to use women's rights
So the argument you want
to
to help
promote that one.
yes, the argument you want to help the population to be more democratic and happier, to get their democratic system like you have in the West is not really relevant because
Yeah,
that's not what they're trying to do anywhere.
exactly. Please take that argument and put it in the trash. Just
Okay.
don't even entertain it.
Could we finish up by informing people where they can follow you? I mean, I of course put all the links in the video description and articles, but it's good to hear you say, like, I think it's easiest to follow you on Twitter. What's your Twitter account?
It is Partisan Girl. PARTISANGIRL.
And you also
So
regularly have like a YouTube channel. Which one is that?
yes, it's Syrian Girl Partisan.
And then you also have a Patreon where you like people who want to support you, give a
Oh,
donation, right?
yes, please. If you would like, please throw me $1 at my Patreon, which is Syrian Girl.
Yeah, okay. And then you have different I don't know if people use Patreon, you have different tiers where you can select how much you wanna. There's $1 and upwards, I think.
Yes, I'm happy with even $1, really. I like to just see people following me on there. It's
Yeah.
not so much about the money.
And I don't know
So yeah,
if it's secret, we can edit it out. But you also you've been talking about making some kind of web page in the future, so.
I am. I've been talking about it for a while, but give me the next couple of months. If it's not done, then I will ask for
Yeah.
your.
Yeah. Okay. So then you're gonna have one platform where you can have everything together somehow.
Yes, please.
Yeah. But I think you have a reach like a quite big media company. If you see how many people follow you, it's quite like one person who has some talent and dedication can make a lot of influence still.
I hope they let me keep it because in the current climate, censorship is anyone can be, cut away, and you'll never hear about them again. They'll go into the abyss because unfortunately now social media is how people are able to speak.
Yeah.
They have complete control over that. So I hope they will let me keep my platform.
Okay. Okay. I think that's it. So do you have any last final words to people who took the time to listen?
Don't be afraid of dangerous thoughts.
Okay. Okay, that's great. We're trying to get the truth out there, and yeah. Okay, but
Thank you so much.
we'll maybe follow up in another 6 months or so. Hopefully, it keeps going. I think it's still improvement in the region, but it takes time.
Well, thanks for having me on. I hope it's not too boring or too long.
No, it's great. It's interesting. Okay, but we talk again. So be safe.
We'll talk soon. You
Bye.
too. Bye.